Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the seminar by Prof. Belinda Reyers. She agreed to do a seminar with ACDI, really trying to find ways that we can even try and collaborate in the future. So Belinda is Research Chair in Sustainability Science at Future Africa at the University of Pretoria. She also holds a joint position as Senior Advisor at the Stockholm Resilience Centre and is an extraordinary professor at Stellenbosch University. And I think many of you are here because you know Belinda or you know of Belinda's work, but she spent many years exploring the links between society and ecosystems and what this means for sustainable development. And some of you may have been at her last talk, also hosted by ACDI, on how to achieve equity and sustainability as one of the most concerning global challenges. So she is considered a world leader in socio-ecological systems, resilience, and ecosystem services. And with that, Belinda, I'm going to hand over to you. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Fiona, and thanks Claire and ACDI for hosting this. It's such a fantastic opportunity, and I've just been looking through the participant list, and the one joy of these virtual presentations is how I see names from people I haven't seen for years who I'm now able to reconnect with, and also some more recent friends and colleagues. So thanks everyone for joining. As Fiona said, the idea behind this presentation initially was to talk a little bit about mutual interests in the sort of climate change and development and ecosystems and society space. But considering the broader audience, I'm just going to talk a little bit more generally initially about some of this research and really take this as an opportunity to distill out what I see as some of the most exciting and important avenues and areas of research that connect ecosystems and society and use a sort of complex systems perspective to really explore the relationships between the two and how that relates to development and sustainable development. So before I get going into that, I thought I'd spend a couple of slides just setting the larger scene of why I think research that connects ecosystems and societies is important and useful and innovative. And I think, we're all very aware of the fact that humans have had an impact on the world's ecosystems, but I think what we're less aware of is that this is not recent. In fact, the human impact on ecosystems goes back millennia, as this slide shows, with most ecosystems having quite intense human impacts for at least 500 up to 8,000 years. And even for non-terrestrial systems, we know this to be true for freshwater bodies as well as ocean and atmosphere systems. And even for parts of the maps that are often grayed out or where we don't have data available for those kinds of global studies, we now see emerging studies like in Central Africa and across the African continent showing that at least for 2,000 to 3,000 years, humans have had quite extreme and intense impacts through fire and clearing and other activities, really shaping ecosystems in quite fundamental ways. What we also know is that there is no such thing really as remote anymore these days. There aren't really remote ecosystems, that in this globalized and hyper-connected world where resources and information and trade connects almost everywhere with everywhere else, this kind of impact is all pervasive of humans on ecosystems. We also know from the work of Will Stephan and colleagues in the IGBP program that across multiple variables looking at these changes in societies and ecosystems, the last 50 or 70 years, which you see here marked by the dotted line on these graphs, we see a major uptick and increase in the scale and the intensity of these impacts of people on ecosystems. So I think it's fair to say that we no longer sit in a situation where humans have an impact on ecosystems. We actually are in a situation where humans are a part of ecosystems, where they shape the patterns and the processes and the functions of ecosystems in quite fundamental ways and across the world. But at the same time that humans have been shaping ecosystems in these ways, so ecosystems have shaped us and our societies and our development. And not just in the sort of obvious material ways of giving us some food and some building materials and water and clean air, but actually shaping what we live in and where we live and how we live, not just providing food, but shaping what sort of foods we eat, how we eat those foods, with whom we eat those foods, and when we eat those foods. And we know now, as we sit in this sort of time of a global pandemic, how important these links between ecosystems and human health are, and not just for the risk of zoonotic diseases like the coronavirus, but actually for many dimensions of physical health and even mental health that show a strong shaping by ecosystems. And this is obviously not just work that's done by ecologists or in the area of ecosystem services. We see this increasingly in areas of expertise, such as the study of human well-being, which you see here at the bottom in the middle, where more and more work is showing human well-being as a sort of co-constitution between the personal, the societal, and the environmental relationships that people and societies have. And similarly, areas like biocultural diversity, which have existed for a long time, have studied the sort of interconnection between ecology, culture, language, and spiritual beliefs, and how that changes and is shaped over time. And so it becomes very clear that these sort of ecosystem people interdependencies are so much more than just, something like ecosystem services or material flows, but are actually strong shapers and mutual interdependencies. And so this was really an area of work that I got to dig into very early on in my career when I became part of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment as one of their early career fellows, just as I was finishing my PhD, which is basically about 20 years ago today, or this week. And I also got involved in the Southern African Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, really studying how ecosystems support societies and how societies are changing ecosystems and what that means for societies and human well-being more broadly. But I think over time, my interest became also to move beyond how we sort of are shaped by our local environments, to think about what do these ecosystem people or ecosystem society linkages look like if we start to think about the world that we live in today, this globalized and hyper-connected world, where we are reliant on some far distant ecosystems for things like our food, and we have impacts on far distant societies and on far distant ecosystems in this kind of very interconnected global context that we live in. And so what do these sorts of relationships look at if we start to zoom out from the local? And at the same time, starting to realize that when we talk about the human imprint on the world and the world's imprint and ecosystems imprints on people, it's not homogeneous and uniform. We're actually looking at very different circumstances and very different relationships in this very hyper-connected world, where the slide that I take out of the latest intergovernmental panel on biodiversity and ecosystem services shows the very different imprints that developed and developing countries have on ecosystems, and similarly the very different benefits that developed and developing countries get from these ecosystems as well. And sort of who bears the costs and who bears the benefits becomes a very clear asymmetry between developed and developing in this context. And so wanting to make sure that we don't try and homogenize these results and actually take into account the very diverse contexts that exist in the world around these relationships between people and nature or societies and ecosystems. And so this brought me then about 10 years ago to this area of complex social ecological systems research, which was really fast-tracked and enabled by my engagement with the Stockholm Resilience Centre over the last 10 years, initially in a part-time way, including my team at the CSR, where you see there on the left, also learning how to ice skate on a lake in Stockholm, and then in a more full-time capacity when I got to spend time there, leading one of their resilience and development programs. And so I think, this was really an important part for me to go and actually learn from many of the people who were the sort of founding thinkers of social ecological systems research and what it was all about. And so before I get into some of these avenues and insights, I thought I would spend a bit of time explaining what social ecological systems research is all about. What is a social ecological system? And so there are a lot of definitions of social ecological systems. This one that's on the left of the slide, the picture is one of my favorites, showing it sort of this bringing together of humans and nature and treating them as a single system. And at the same time, making clear that it's about complex adaptive systems and this interdependence of society and ecosystems. So the graphic on the top right is one that I've put together over time to try and capture what I think are the key essence or ingredients of a social ecological systems approach. They are first and foremost complex adaptive systems. And so complex adaptive systems are systems that are made up of diverse agents and objects and entities that interact with one another in dynamic and often nonlinear ways, and from which interactions we see emergent properties and behaviors that are greater than or at least different to those individual entities or agents. And so social ecological systems are a type of complex adaptive system that focus strongly on these social and ecological interdependencies. The focus is very much on sustainability within these social ecological systems, and much of the early work on social ecological systems adopted the strong humans in nature perspective. So this moving away from this idea of humans and nature as separate and separable. I think a key part of social ecological systems then is this work on resilience, which I'm going to share a little bit about. And it's acknowledging the fact that we live in changeable, turbulent times where things change in expected and unexpected ways. And so resilience, which is really about these capacities to persist or to adapt or to transform through change, is part and parcel of the sort of social ecological systems research repertoire. But I think also importantly to acknowledge, and I think you'll see this as I go through the presentation, social ecological systems research is clearly interdisciplinary as it brings strongly from the social and natural sciences working together. But it's also beyond that, it's transdisciplinary in its engagement with actors and knowledge systems beyond the academic disciplines, engaging with some of the real world complex challenges of sustainable development. It's a booming area of research. As you can see in the last 10 years, heaps of publications on social ecological systems, and also just a breakdown of those publications, giving one an insight of how strongly interdisciplinary this field has become over time, especially its engagement with the social and natural sciences. So these 4 areas of research, which I'm going to briefly introduce, that I think have been sort of major aha moments for me from this vast literature of social ecological systems, are really first about how social ecological systems analyze and understand and engage with the social and ecological relationships and interdependencies, how social ecological systems research goes beyond this idea of local versus global to start really thinking about the cross-scale telecouplings that connect the local, regional, and the global, and how those dynamics can shape things at local and at global scales. I'm going to briefly touch on these ideas of nonlinear dynamics and the problem with predictability in social ecological systems. And then lastly, look, I think an area that's probably relevant to most listening in here on this idea of resilience and transformative change, and the avenues there that I see that are interesting. So for the first shift on this, or the first insight or major area, I think I see social ecological systems research really challenging the dominant perspective we have in our science and in our policy arenas on this idea that societies and ecosystems interact with one another in quite simple and material ways through ecosystems providing a flow of resources like food and water to societies, and societies in turn managing and impacting on ecosystems through waste or clearing or fire, etc. And so social ecological systems move beyond these kind of very material and structural perspectives to really focus a lot on the fact that we're not just dealing with social systems and ecological systems, but actually the interactions between the two, those social ecological interdependencies and feedbacks that I think are probably some of the major drivers of many of the sustainability problems we see out in the world, and especially how those interact with one another and then create these patterns of emergence that have such consequences for sustainable development outcomes. This figure on the left is quite a lot to take in. I'm going to dig into it a bit more with some of the research we've been doing to share that a little bit more in detail. And on the right, I think social ecological systems is really trying to move together with many other fields of research beyond this idea that the only values we get from ecosystems are the material or monetized values or the livelihood values, and actually digging into how ecosystems really are important for culture, for identity, for sense of place, for spirituality, for ethical and moral, as well as social and nature relationships that I think many people are starting to realizing as we go through various phases of lockdown, at least in the urban context that many of us live in. So some of these ideas, my colleague Liz Seelig and I took forward when we were working as part of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is quite a mouthful, but it's basically the IPCC for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And we were given this task of saying, what does biodiversity mean for these 16 Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has set for the world to achieve by 2030? And instead of going through this exhaustive system mapping that a lot of people do, of saying this is how biodiversity relates to hunger, and this is how biodiversity relates to poverty, understanding that those links are dynamic and ever-changing and actually very context-specific, we rather focused on trying to get an idea of what are the nature of the feedbacks between these social, largely social goals of poverty or health and biodiversity and ecosystem services. And we did a similar thing with some of the Sustainable Development Goals, which don't even mention ecosystems or their roles, but for which we know ecosystems play an important role in things like education, gender equality, and reduced inequalities. And so really trying to foster a more complex and nuanced approach to trying to understand how these things matter and change over time. And from that, Liz and I then actually challenged ourselves to say, could we use a framework like this to suggest what sort of policy targets? Some of you may know that the Convention on Biological Diversity is setting the next decade worth of biodiversity targets that all countries will have to sign and try and meet. And at the moment, most of those targets are about species extinction rates or about protected area extent, but don't often focus on these social ecological interdependencies. So we used this analysis to try and shift how some of those targets might actually benefit from some of the research that's gone on in social ecological systems research. And there's a table in that paper for anyone who's interested to hear more about them. I presented this, as Shiona said, looking at how we can sort of use social ecological systems approaches to stop treating equity and sustainability as if one is the cause of the other, but actually acknowledging that it is these complex dynamics that cause problems for both equity and sustainability. And so we have a typology of those. And there's obviously interesting research emerging in the social ecological system space for how you study both equity and sustainability, so that you're making sure what you're doing for one doesn't undermine the other, which is often the risk. Moving on to the second avenue of interest, which is, I think, this move from sort of thinking about scales as kind of multiple and nested or hierarchical, moving towards this idea of scales as very much connected by these telecouplings and cross-scale dynamics. A good example that I used to have to really work hard to teach on is this idea of emerging zoonotic disease. I feel like we don't have to really teach what that is anymore as we live through the COVID-19 crisis. But just giving a sense that, you know, zoonotic disease is not just about someone who ate a bat. It's really not a simple causality that underlies these. It actually is a multitude of interacting effects across scales, including the impact of fisheries and overfishing on dietary changes in communities. This is an example in West Africa. Impacts of climate change on droughts, on what people are eating and forcing more people into bushmeat eating and trading, and then how that increases the risk of these disease outbreaks, but then also how global connectedness of travel, etc., allows that to cascade back across the region. And there are wonderful pieces of analysis and new sets of methods that allow us to stop just studying the local or the global or the national and start seeing how so many of these feedbacks actually connect across scales. And I think of an example here on rainfall. We often know about the fact that rain doesn't always fall in your country. We've got to do a lot of transboundary management here in South Africa, for example, because rain that we need falls in Lesotho or it falls in other neighboring countries, or rain that falls in South Africa flows through South Africa and into Mozambique. So we talk a lot about watershed management and the need to manage across boundaries. But if you start to analyze where that rain actually originally came from as evaporation, we start to understand these enormous telecouplings that connect not just neighboring countries, but far distant, almost continental reaches of countries connected to each other. And a land use choice in one country can have very harsh consequences for rainfall in a far distant country. And these sorts of models, I think, proving to be quite interesting to explore what the challenges really of water governance and water management are going to look like in the future as we contend with the challenges of climate change. And this work is being pulled together very nicely in some work that looks at what are called offstage burdens. So how often we make decisions about how to manage ecosystems or how to manage these feedbacks with ecosystems and society, but we don't think about how those ripple across scales. And this paper looks at, for example, the fishing pressures that have really changed in Europe as Europe has started to regulate its fisheries more, and how their fish stocks are recovering, but how this has just displaced fishing pressures into the West African waters, or how China and Europe have done a lot to increase forest and land cover, and they report on this as a very positive area of progress in their biodiversity and climate change targets. But what we don't often see is how this deforestation to support Chinese and European biomass imports has just been relocated into the tropics of Southeast Asia and Africa. And so we start to see the fact that, you know, these problems can't just be approached at a single scale, but one really is dealing with very open systems. And we need new methods to be able to understand and analyze those open systems, but also to think about how we manage them and engage with them in policy and practice. And Neil Adger, of course, for a long time has been working on these ideas of teleconnected vulnerabilities. And I think this is very obvious in a lot of the climate change work that everyone's working on, where we're scurrying to try and adapt to climate change in parts of the world that actually weren't originally emitting these greenhouse gas emissions that are causing the climate change. So how these changes move around the world and land in far distant places, and how we address these vulnerabilities, and how we can't just keep doing that as a local scale problem. And I think so interesting work that I see pulling these two insights together of the sort of social ecological interdependencies and how those cut across borders is, I think that this work first and foremost challenges the fact that when you draw a boundary between what is a social system and what is an ecological system, or what is local and what is regional, and we often have to draw boundaries in order to do our research, we need to remember that those boundaries are artificial and are really just a construct of our own research. And therefore they're quite arbitrary and they have consequences for the research we do. And interestingly, we're seeing quite a big shift now from treating the sort of social and ecological spaces as quite separate or separable, starting to acknowledge these interactions and feedbacks, but increasingly starting to see a lot of research and other knowledge systems that acknowledge that these systems were never separable in the first place and that they should be treated as intertwined and co-evolving. And I think interesting research there from colleagues in Botswana, Professor Chilisa, for example, bringing in more African knowledge systems that never really separated the social and the ecological in the first place. And as I said, in fields like human well-being, we're seeing a similar sort of accounting for the fact that you're not dealing with separate systems, but actually the relationships between the personal, the social, and the environmental. And then I think this work by Gina Zevroville really illustrating how one needs to be thinking about how we connect agency at individual levels to social cohesion at societal levels, all the way through to life support systems at planetary scales. And Michelle Lee's work really showing how it's this ability to cross scales that's one of the key constraints for most of our work in the adaptation and transformation space. And is really proving to be a real stumbling block for a lot of the research, policy, and practice efforts. So I think this lines up a lot with what the late Georgina Mace was always trying to get us to think about, how we're sort of shifting in our perspectives as a biodiversity community. Was this paper that she wrote, you know, the perception of nature as something that people change and that people have impacts on, or people as the beneficiaries of nature, and sort of moving away from this idea of them as separate and changing each other to rather thinking about them as together in shaping social ecological systems, and the need for more interdisciplinary approaches to start studying them together. And I think we're also seeing this kind of move in development and in sustainable development, but also global development and even some parts of economic development, moving away from this idea that we've got these three pillars of development of environment, society, and economy that are sort of separate and a bit interchangeable and at times overlapping, to really thinking about them in more embedded and interwoven ways. I'm going to very briefly touch on this insight because I don't want to take up all the time speaking. I want to make sure there's time for questions. But, I think one of the bigger challenges that we're always dealing with, especially when we're trying to engage with decision makers and policy spaces, is this idea that when I do something to an ecosystem or to a society, I have some expectation of proportional inputs and proportional outputs. Like if I build 10 schools, I expect a 10-fold increase in education levels. Or if I pollute this water here, it'll be bad now, but it'll fade over time and over space. But in fact, we know that most systems don't behave in these linear and predictable ways. There are all these connections, all these feedbacks, and all these dynamics that really result in surprising responses to any particular intervention or impact made in a system. And I think this really challenges a lot of the work we do, where there's this idea that if I make this investment, I will see a similar sort of proportional output from that investment in whatever work I'm doing. And so this has brought in this idea of nonlinear dynamics and tipping points. I mean, many of you are familiar with it. The one I'm going to talk a little bit about is this notion of planetary boundaries, which some of you may be familiar with, the idea that there are these 9 big Earth system variables, and we've changed them a lot, and we're moving them to some sort of inflection point, beyond which we're going to see sort of undesirable or irreversible or runaway change. And biodiversity was proposed as one of these. And I think this was work that I did a couple of 6 or 7 years ago with Georgina Mace and several others in the biodiversity and ecology communities, really trying to think through what do we even have such a thing as a global boundary of biodiversity loss, and thinking that through. And there are a couple of papers which have taken that a bit forward. But I think what was interesting about that was really thinking about there probably isn't a big global tipping point in biodiversity. Like there isn't sort of, if we lose one more species, we're going to go into some sort of type of change, but really thinking about this at biome or regional scales and what some of these tipping points might look like and how these might actually be cumulative over space and time was one area that I think is potentially quite interesting, and especially considering the Southern African context where we have so many of these types of biomes, okay, not the Arctic tundra, but others, to start thinking about, what are the potentials for big tips and big changes in these systems that would be undesirable from a continental or regional well-being perspective. And I think the point that I come to from a sort of more complex and social ecological systems perspective was this idea that we put forward in the paper that maybe the biodiversity boundary itself is less relevant. It's more about how it interacts with all these other boundaries. And we know that there's so many important feedback effects between biodiversity and climate and pollution and water and ozone and land use. And so biodiversity almost seen as kind of the regulator. And we know this has become a very popular area in, say, climate change adaptation, thinking about how we can use biodiversity or forest cover or mangroves or whatever to help us adapt and deal with some of these, avoiding some of these reinforcing feedbacks of climate change. And I think this resulted in the update of the planetary boundaries in 2015, where the proposal was made that maybe biodiversity, which was then labeled biosphere integrity, to get away from this focus on extinction rates only, to see it as one of these core boundaries which really regulates and is regulated by the other planetary boundaries. And I think this is something quite interesting to think about in the Southern African context as well. Then from a sort of, for those of you who love models and love really complicated papers and ideas, there's some interesting approaches and work that goes on actually combining these ideas of social ecological feedbacks and interdependencies, the cross scale and the nonlinear, to think about things like the potential for interacting and coalescing shocks. And some work that Juan Rocha at the Stockholm Resilience Centre recently completed on this notion of cascading regime shifts that connect across scales and how we might be able to analyze and look at ways of predicting or forecasting some of those. But this leads me on to the point about methods. And, this field of social ecological systems has been around now for, I'd say, a good 10 years in a sort of substantive way. And we're now starting to see reviews and potential for a lot of methods that are very interdisciplinary, bringing a lot of natural science and social science methods together in interesting ways. And my colleague Odi Salamani and I were able to do a big review of the UK's ecosystem services and poverty alleviation work that was funded by the UK government as well as DFID, and had a lot of cases around Africa, including South Africa. And those are just some findings from our chapter in the book, where we look at some of the innovative methods that are coming up, able to combine long-term social and ecological data and other interesting data sets to be able to get more insights into some of these complex relationships. And very soon there will be the release of a handbook of research methods for social ecological systems, written by colleagues at Stellenbosch University and Stockholm University and elsewhere in South Africa, trying to pull together some of these advances that we've seen in these methods that are able to bring the social and the ecological together in quite rigorous and robust ways. And then on to the last insight. I'm just going to have some water for my own resilience. And so this kind of avenue of research is one that has kept me very busy, especially in the last 5 years, as I've been working a lot in this resilience and development space. And this idea of resilience is a very popular one. You've all heard about it. It's got so many definitions, so many debates. I'm not really going to go into that, although there is an article and a link that I post here where it's a popular article that a couple of us wrote to try and give some sense of the history of the term resilience and its current usage. This is just a review of the social-ecological systems resilience literature in the field of sustainability, just showing the increased interest and publications in this space. But despite all the fact that there's a lot of debate and a lot of diversity about what resilience means, depending on which field or which sector you work in, and it's quite hard to make sense of it, and it's kind of been accused of being a buzzword or a fuzzword. What I see that's very interesting here is that this idea of resilience as a set of capacities, of absorptive capacities or capacities to be able to stay the same despite some large shock or change, adaptive capacities, which are the sort of these capacities to be flexible and adapt to these changes, and transformative capacities, which are these ideas that the system can actually go through a massive structural reorganization in order to keep developing despite the context of change. And what's interesting is, even though these, I'm drawing here from public health, economics, disaster management, engineering, international development, very disparate fields, very disparate users of the concept of resilience, but all starting to converge on this idea of these resilience capacities of absorbing, adapting, and transforming. And so I've been digging a bit into this area of convergence and obviously, you know, the wonderful similarities, but also a rich diversity that underlies that, to see what's going on in the space. And I think there's been a lot of recent work pulling together what are the features and processes of ecosystems that support these capacities, in this case, just the adaptive capacity, and a lot of work going on putting together the sort of social adaptive capacities and trying to bridge these structural and agency types of perspectives on these adaptive capacities. Not so much work looking at how they interact with each other. Can social capacities reinforce or undermine ecological capacities, and what do those relationships look like over space and over time? But I think there is a growing body of work on this, which is proving to look quite interesting, and I think has important consequences for climate change adaptation, but also just the turbulence that lies ahead in all the work that we do. There's also a lot of work that's pulled together on what might be shaping these resilience capacities. There's the work by Wency Biggs that pulls together the 7 principles of resilience in the context of human well-being and ecosystems. There's Jamila Haider's work that looks at sort of poverty traps and the resilience in those traps, and what are the key features such as the external factors or the path dependencies that shape those. And then there's Michelle Lee and Per Olsen's work that pulls together some of these ideas of the multiple scales of especially innovation and transformative change. And so I think there's a growing body of work around not only moving us beyond this idea of listing the assets that are these capacities. There's a tendency for people to think like financial assets, social assets, infrastructure assets are what are behind these capacities, but thinking also about relationships and the dynamics and the role of diversity and connectivity and the cross scale in shaping capacities. And so this is from a recent publication from Jamila Haider and a couple of us at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, pulling together, sort of what might be a different perspective on development or sustainable development and the role of resilience. And I think many of you might be more familiar with those kind of classic development graphs where you've just got a line sort of going up, and every now and then it's got a shock, so it drops down, and then someone builds its resilience and it bounces back up. And so we're really trying to challenge those ideas of development as a linear process towards a particular outcome, to see it in a way that acknowledges the fact that the social and the ecological systems shape and are shaped by each other over time, and that the resilience capacities within these systems then determine the ability, as these systems evolve over time, to either adapt, to persist, or to transform through change. And thus determining several outcomes that are relevant to sustainable development. And I think this is really some new thinking that is at the moment still at a conceptual level, but we do actually have an example in this one that Jamila draws from her work in the Pamirs in Tajikistan, but really trying to think through development in a more sort of systems and complex systems and social ecological perspective. To think about what these potential pathways are and how interventions don't end up actually undermining these necessary resilience capacities. And we often see that in the development space, where seeds are introduced or technologies introduced without a sense of how that's actually going to be taken up in and be shaped by the systems in which it's being introduced in. And so what's been quite exciting is late last year, we were approached by the Human Development Report, which is a big United Nations development program, to actually capture the year in human development and give some sense of where the planet is, where society and human development is going. And for the first time, there was a real engagement with the idea of planetary and ecosystem change and what that means for human development. And there's a podcast that I share here, as well as the full report that's also available. And I think one can get a sense that it's not just in the field of research that we're seeing these big shifts in how we analyze and engage with complex systems, but even in these big areas of policy and practice, in really rethinking this idea of development as expanding human freedoms in balance with the planet. And so this, I think there were several really important parts of this report and this interaction between the social ecological systems research and this human development idea. And one of which is captured in the left-hand side figure, where for a change, we're not seeing a sort of report that says this is what we need to do to enhance equity, or this is what we need to do to enhance sustainability, but a real acknowledgement of how everything we do moving forward for human development needs to be thinking about both as we start sort of focusing on these areas of innovation. And I think that for me is really, this iceberg diagram for me captures a lot of the work of complex social ecological systems and how we're trying to draw people beneath the ideas of just collecting data on the shocks and the stresses and the inequalities and the unsustainabilities, to try and understand the sort of feedbacks and patterns and processes underlying those. And of course, the systemic structures and root causes beneath those, and even beneath those, digging into some of our mental models and paradigms of environment and development. And I think that's where this report really resonated with me, in its fact that it says it's time to stop believing in these stark distinctions between environment and development and between people and nature. And I think it sort of resonates with this frustration that I feel a lot with the fact that we're often told that we can either choose development or choose the environment, when in fact we seem to be making choices that are bad for both. And so I think we see sort of approaches coming out of the policy and practice environment that are far more interested in how we think about the social and the ecological at the same time, and not sort of pit one off against the other, but think about a more collaborative approach to development with the planet. And so that's my final slide. I just wanted to wrap up by kind of reminding everyone what those four sort of avenues of research were that I think are particularly relevant, but that is just my opinion. I put the ... there, as I think there's several other avenues of research in social ecological systems that are incredibly relevant. And also just to say that just because it's me that you're seeing here doesn't mean that this is all my own work. this is really the result of enormous groups of wonderful people that I've had the privilege of working with in South Africa and around the world, the early career researchers, the amazing international networks, amazing practitioners and policymakers working in this space. And on the bottom right, my mom, who I think gets the record for today, having listened to the most virtual lectures that I have given of any other person. And in that picture, she is practicing her snow angel in Sweden. And I'll leave with that. Thanks, everyone. I look forward to good conversations and questions with you all.
Thank you very much, Belinda. You know, as always, a very illuminating and beautifully presented talk. Stimulated, I'm sure, lots of questions and ideas. So we'll open up for questions. You can either put up your hand, or we're very happy if you type your question into the chat, and we'll try and pick it up and make sure that it gets to Belinda. So over to the audience now for your questions, comments, any points you'd like to make, you know, please go ahead. Thanks.
Petra, do you want to unmute yourself and you can just ask your question?
Thanks, Claire. Thank you, Belinda. That was really, really interesting and great talk. You mentioned, slightly off topic, but maybe not, you mentioned the targets for the Convention of Biological Diversity and the fact that they're mostly focused on protected area extent and species levels of extinction and so on. I did notice in the most recent version that there are some additional targets and goals being added that are a bit different in their thinking. But my question is really about the indicators. So I feel like measuring these the existing targets has been difficult in itself. So if we had to add a level of feedback between social and ecological systems, do you think that we're in a place to be able to adequately measure these for something like these large conventions in terms of reporting to them?
Thanks, Petra. That's a great question. And I mean, I think that the point is, if we keep relying on the existing data we have, we're going to be in trouble. You know, and I think that, I mean, this point has been made over the last decade that we don't really have many fit for purpose indicators to measure the kinds of sustainability challenges that we're all interested in. But I'm always amazed to see when someone sets an intent to say we need to start measuring this, then usually, you know, the community comes together and starts finding the funding and finding the resources to do that. And I think we actually in this paper use a lot of examples where we try to show that there are some avenues of people starting to do that. For example, in the ocean health space, where we're seeing a big move away from this reliance on these indicators of what I call the biodiversity quantities, like extent of an ecosystem or number of species, and rather starting to capture the biodiversity qualities like integrity or processes or functions, or the aspects of biodiversity we know to be relevant to a set of ecosystem services. So I think the point we're trying to make isn't that the current indicators are wrong. I mean, they're certainly useful for a bunch of things. Like if you want to track how, you know, populations of wild species, wild vertebrates are doing, we've got some great indicators of that, but they're not necessarily that helpful when you're trying to think about how does this relate to our efforts to achieve peace, or how does this relate to our efforts to alleviate poverty. And so we were starting to show some avenues of where there are potential targets and indicators, or even just data sets that exist, maybe not at a global scale, but where we can say a lot more about, oh, look, here's this change in water security, and here's how it had a link to the increase in conflict in middle-income countries. And I think that there's sort of interesting areas around that that are well worth exploring, and that I sometimes feel that if the policy frameworks don't challenge us to start moving in those directions, when will we? Thanks, Petra. Neville seems to be trying to raise his hand.
Hi.
Hi, Neville.
Hi, Belinda. Nice to see you and hear you. Thank you.
Thanks, Neville.
Okay, so I know all the words that you're using individually, but not so much when they're all put together in a sentence. You know, at least conceptually, I mean, I stress I'm claiming that this is my fault entirely. I'm not familiar with the literature. I find it very overwhelming. It seems to me that there's no right way or an ideal way to approach problems. If considerations have so many interacting elements and dimensions, how do we solve these problems? How do we use this approach to solve problems? So, just to go on a bit, if there are multiple drivers, multiple impacts at different scales, do we need to consider all of these to address problems properly? Do we lose the value of linear relationships or cellular level questions, for example? So I want to know how this is applied. And I just want to mention that it's interesting you mentioned public health in one of your slides. So I'm learning a bit about public health, and public health is like, it is to medicine what social-ecological and resilience sciences is to cell biology. It's obviously very important and critical that we look at things in this way and at this scale. But it makes it all very difficult to treat people and problems. So I agree, it's pointless putting a plaster, say, on an AIDS patient's wound without understanding the social and political and historical determinants of health, but shouldn't plaster on the wound. So I really am asking, where do we start to intervene in a system that has no beginning and no end? Thanks, Belinda.
Thanks, Neville. Yes, and I think this is a common concern that's raised when one sort of starts to understand the complexity of the challenges. It's very easy to make the mistake that means that they're impossible and that we need to know everything before we can do anything. And that's not the point that I think I wanted to make here. I think I'm wanting to make 2 points. The first is, if we acknowledge that these are complex problems in that they have multiple objects interacting in nonlinear ways, creating outcomes that are different from those sums of the parts, if we insist on just studying some of those parts, then I think we're probably going about it the wrong way, that this idea that a complex problem can be solved by linear reductionist mechanistic thinking, we've seen that just doesn't work, right? But I think what instead I'm trying to propose is that there actually are methods, approaches, practices that are drawn from the complex systems literature. And I was trying to show some of those through the handbook or through the reviews that I've done that are much more fit for purpose for taking on a complex problem. So if all you're interested in is a wound with a band-aid, then I wouldn't say come to complex systems work. But if you're interested in climate change and its implications for the future of poverty alleviation in Southern Africa, then I would argue that using a linear approach that just looks at one part of that problem without engaging with the other disciplines and the other sectors is going to not only not give you the answer, it's likely to give you the wrong answer. So I think I'm trying to find this balance between an approach that fits the problem. And I don't think actually there are some complex systems approaches that allow you to see, oh, that is where I need to engage. And so you don't end up having to engage with every driver and every dynamic and every feedback, but it tells you where to engage, and then it usually helps you design some sort of a monitoring or a learning system so that you can watch out for emergent patterns and to see if it's actually moving in the direction that you wanted it to move. And I think that that's really what the complex system sort of toolboxes offer us. So I would say there's a risk if we don't start using those approaches, and they're actually not that hard to use. They're just different, and you can't do them by yourself. You have to work in teams, obviously, because it is so interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary.
Thank you.
Thanks, Belinda. Well, it feels clearer to me. Mark, you're up next.
Well, thanks, Belinda. Obviously, lots and lots of questions, but I'll restrict it to two. So the first is, and they're kind of interlinked. So I'm wondering if any of the literature you've talked about, there's sort of real examples of, and I'm particularly interested in the resilience side of it, but obviously all different aspects of of how the theory is sort of being confronted by practice. So if you think of like the 100 Resilient Cities program, it's got a very nice theoretical framing. Are those kind of academic really sort of conceptual frameworks, do they actually deliver in practice, or is there kind of a really big difference between the real world and sort of, you know, of trying to build a resilient city and what's propositioned from a theoretical perspective? And then the second is just sort of stimulated by what you're doing in IPCC at the moment. You know, there's a big debate about soft and hard limits to adaptation. And I wondered if there were also soft and hard limits to resilience as being a route to development. So basically, sort of, does resilience as a mechanism for social ecological development or social development, does it only operate within a certain, I don't know, I mean, it's the wrong way to put it, but operating space. So, I mean, if we push the social, if the social ecological system is so totally stressed, then a resilience approach actually just fails because you've exceeded some limits for resilience to actually work. Yeah. So.
Yeah, tough questions, Mark. I mean, on the first one, I think, you know, I would say that's almost one of the most interesting areas of research at the moment, is this space between theory and practice, where practice, you know, so that was the work we were doing in the last 5 years at the SRC, was working with practitioners in the resilience and development space to see what their conceptual models were so that we could use those to, you know, evolve our theories, because those conceptual frameworks are coming out of practice. And at the same time, using our theories to see how those might fall in practice and how those might shape their conceptual frameworks. And I think it's this iteration between theory and practice that is the most generative space for a lot of this work, and why I'm thoroughly convinced a lot of it has to happen in these transdisciplinary ways. And, you know, I think what's interesting is that as academics, we often think that we're the ones with the conceptual frameworks and the high levels of abstraction. But actually, when you're working in practice, I mean, the complexity is right there. It confronts you. And I found it far more easy in many instances to engage almost immediately on similar conceptual topics with practitioners working in these complex realities than it is sometimes to work with someone who's sitting in a department of zoology studying one thing. So I think that there's an ease to it that not many of us expect, and a readiness for it. But I think it's a very fertile and generative testing ground for many of our theories and our own practices. And then on your other question about the soft and hard limits, I'm not too sure I know exactly what that concept looks like in climate change. Are you asking, like, is there a time where resilience isn't useful and is more useful?
Yeah. So maybe in the climate change space, a hard limit would be essentially where, I don't know, so you're a low-lying island and you get, you know, sea level rise is too high and there's no in-place adaptation. So that's a hard limit. A soft limit is more around sort of the social and economic and cultural and other aspects, maybe even financial capacities, governance. So adaptation might be possible, but the way the particular system is structured, it makes the kinds of adaptations that are needed impossible. So I guess that's talking more to the reality of sort of what a resilient system might look like, and whether, you know, there just are fundamental sort of soft limits, as we would call them, that make it really, really hard to deliver resilience as kind of a system property or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to give it a little bit more thought. I mean, I think there's this interesting sort of area of resilience which talks almost in similar ways about when is adaptation the right response and when is transformation the right response. And the idea behind transformation is when the current system becomes untenable and you're almost talking about an entire systemic reconfiguration. And so I think that, you know, potentially those are where limits apply. And what's interesting is who should adapt and who should transform and when and how those interact across scales and levels is one of the more kind of unknown aspects of resilience at this time. I know Johan Rockström, when he often talks about resilience, he sort of says if we hadn't sort of done what we've done to the world, then resilience wouldn't really be necessary, right? That you only really need it when you're trying to navigate turbulence and uncertainty and the kind of large scale shocks that we see. But I might have to get back to you a bit on what the hard limits might be. and whether they actually exist in terms of resilience as a system property.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Belinda. I think I need to look at some of the questions in chat. Paxi Chura asks, how do you see the curricula changing in the South African higher education, since we have quite rigid modular approaches within faculties?
Great question, Paxi, and one I could talk on for days and days and days. I mean, it's telling that most of this research that I'm referring to has taken place outside of classic academic structures of higher education, for example, at the CSIR in South Africa, and then at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, which was quite an innovative centre that sat outside of faculties at Stockholm University. I mean, I see changes that are happening to allow, I think ACDI is a good example of that, where we're able to find almost new structures that sit outside of the modular approach within faculties. But in some ways, I think those are going to be doomed to sort of a short-term sustainability crisis unless we do something about the necessary governance shifts within those modular approaches within faculties, and start thinking about how we free up the silos and the boundaries that exist within the academic context, especially in the higher education space. I mean, we're able to do that at least at postgraduate levels in general, a little bit more easily these days, but it's still hard at the undergraduate level. And especially, I think for many of us researchers, it's often one of the bigger obstacles that need to be overcome. So I can't say I've got a solution as to how it has to happen, but I certainly think it needs to happen. I think there's some sterling examples of how it's being done in many parts of the world. And even, you know, on African campuses where we've sort of done away with departments and have had more sort of schools of agriculture or schools of rural development have certainly helped to get rid of some of those modular structures. But it's a huge challenge.
Thank you for that. There's a question from Astrid in chat as well. She says, do you see capacities as offset by vulnerabilities? For example, someone may have useful indigenous knowledge, but not given the chance to speak. So it's about capacities in the context of power.
Fantastic question. Thanks, Astrid. I think that, you know, this is a point that we try to make a lot, that often people think capacities are the same as capitals, right? So a person with some assets or some education or a bunch of natural resources is able to cope with change. But actually what often shapes capacities are things like agency and power. And so, you know, Amartya Sen in his early work on capabilities made very clear that it's about assets, but it's also about agencies and the ability to enact and make choices. So I think that I'm very tempted to think about when we talk about capacities, and this was one of the papers I referred to, when we look at the resilience capacities, for example, in a poverty trap, they are so much more often shaped by external factors and those power asymmetries outside of the system of the poverty trap than, you know, and it's not really about investing in the context of that poverty trap. It's also about thinking about how we address those power asymmetries. So I don't necessarily see capacities and vulnerabilities as sort of two sides of the same coin, but I worry that we lose the agency and the abilities focus that is inherent in the concept of capacities and start seeing it as a sort of set of assets, because then I think we will have the problem you're elaborating there, Astrid, about capacities in the context of power and how some people just don't have the capacity to make choices and carve their own futures.
I hope that answered your question, Astrid. Johan, sorry, your hand has been raised for a very long time. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I was just about to type it out, but thanks, Belinda. Super interesting as always. You started answering my question a little bit when you talked about when you answered Mark's. And I'm curious about how you view or to hear your take on how does South Africa's kind of experience of work towards transformation, how do you think that informs the kind of resilience thinking version of transformation, and sort of the the kind of more explicit focus on social issues and addressing inequality in addition to sort of the environmental challenges that we have, and sort of how do you see those differences in interpreting transformations?
Thanks, Johan. That's quite a tough question. I mean, I think as South Africans, one has a better idea of what transformative change really encompasses, right? How it's, if one thinks about the transformative change that we're still going through from apartheid to democracy, one gets a real sense of the levels of that transformative change, you know, underpinned by a massive value chain in our constitution, all the way through the sort of social, political, institutional, and environmental changes. If one looks just at the enormous change in legislation around the environment that happened during that transformation too. So a thorough sort of system-wide reconfiguration. But I think it also makes clear, you know, the challenges of transformation about, you know, transformation isn't just about this window of opportunity to change, which came around in the early 90s, but it's then how do you, you know, sort of cement that transformation and build its resilience, which I think is the phase that many of us are stuck in now in South Africa around, you know, stabilizing this alternate state of our political, economic, and other system, and the sort of vulnerabilities in this process of the potential for power and co-option and sort of a sliding back as well that can happen during this. So I mean, this isn't a very well thought through thing, but I think when people talk about transformative change, I think as a South African, you get how hard it is and how multi-level it is and how all-reaching it is, but also how long it takes. You know, I think that Michelle Moore and Francis Wesley's work shows that your average transformative change takes about 60 years to really happen. And so I think if we use that as an example, then we're a third of the way, or maybe half of the way now. And yeah, so I'm not sure if that answers in detail. I think that there were massive environmental aspects of this transformative change, which nobody really talks about or thinks about. But if you think of the Water Act, of the environmental rights enshrined in the human rights component of the Constitution, I think that there were big changes there that have far-reaching consequences as well for the democracy.
See, there's a couple of other questions in the chat, Claire. Should we take those?
Yeah, I had one here from Camille. Camille Mayer, I don't know do you want to ask your question or should I just read it out? I'll just read it out. Oh, okay. You can, okay, no, ask it, it's fine. It's good to have a conversation.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks a lot for this wonderful presentation and this. I think your slides, your choice of images and schemes are very, very eloquent. So thank you very much for that. I was wondering, what are your thoughts about the recent Dasgupta review? It's quite of a landmark in economics in terms of providing a new understanding of economic space and rethinking the fundamentals of the discipline in light of the most recent natural sciences. So what do you think the Dasgupta review adopts this social ecological system perspective, or is it more linear as we could have seen in, let's say, more traditional economics? Thank you.
Thanks, Camille. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think so. I haven't read the entire review. I've been reading parts of it and then looking at the sort of responses and critiques to it. You know, I think I don't think its intent was to adopt a complexity or social ecological systems perspective. It had a very specific intent in terms of the economics of biodiversity and sort of mainstreaming that a bit more. So I think at that high level, it certainly is a landmark report. I think it probably falls a bit short in some areas on sort of thinking a bit more beyond the material and beyond, and you know, that's the challenge in economics. Although economics is really this sort of study of human well-being, capturing the sort of relational dynamic nature of economics and human well-being is a challenge. So, you know, I'm kind of intrigued by how we can help move forward from reports such as these, or use reports such as these, or reports like the Stern report on climate change, and you know, several of the reports that have come out to try and make the case for ecosystems. But I'd be keen to see if we could do it in sort of not always such resource focused or such, yeah, sort of separate perspectives that biodiversity is relevant to us because of the following things, rather than starting to think a little bit more about these ideas that you can't separate the social and ecological, but then how does that fit into a mainstream economics perspective is my challenge. So I don't think I'm very critical of it. I think it's a great report, but I'm challenged to think about how we can bring some of these ideas from complexity science and social ecological systems a bit more into such a report.
Good, thank you.
Thanks, Claire. And Claire, there was a long question from Neville.
Yeah, I'm about to read it out. Neville says, one thing that I don't see explicitly is politics in your slides. I'm sure it's there implicitly. However, governance and politics at all scales is critical to understand how systems work. So public administration, as in who make and use and implement policy, strengths and weaknesses, and is accountable or not in democracies, or not, or corrupt or not, and political systems, these make or break success of interventions ultimately, and are our ultimate Achilles heel, in my opinion. So yeah, that's from Neville. I don't know if I read it out properly, but it's in the chat.
I'm just reading it as well to make sure I try and understand it.
I don't want to repeat it, but just really about how political systems and politics at all scales really matter in this consideration, in this thinking.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Neville. I mean, I think it's very relevant. I think there is a lot of work on this. It's really not my area of expertise. I'm not a governance expert. I'm not a political scientist, but I have been lucky enough to work with political scientists and water governance people, and I think they're doing some really interesting stuff. For example, on the politics of these cascading crises and what do governance mechanisms need to look at, like that can take into account this need that we need to be able to cross scales as rapidly as resource flows can cross scales. And thinking about the role of trade and governance in that space too, I think is quite key. So I don't have too much to add to this. I don't include it as one of the insights that I've worked on a lot, just because I'm tempted to stay in my area of expertise. But if you're interested, I could certainly share some of those political science and governance publications that review. There's one that actually reviews the complex social ecological systems literature and says what's relevant from a governance perspective that I could certainly send your way.
Okay. Shona, can I make a point?
Sure.
Absolutely, go ahead.
So thanks. I mean, I'll just draw on the sort of fisheries background where I originate from, you know, where things like, you know, research produces a set of recommendations for management of a natural resource. And it's an ecosystem model and so on and so forth that produces these outcomes. And there are so many implications to jobs and to capacity and sustaining capacity of you know, of fishery companies and so on and so forth. And so a minister who has to make a decision about the quota has to take into so many different considerations, including political considerations, own position in the cabinet, the alliance with Labour, and so on and so forth. And so you know, this area is, and whether or not there's some sense of accountability, you know, if the minister makes a bad decision, I always like to make the joke that if a postman falls off his bicycle in some rural village in England, the Minister of Telecommunications resigns. In some countries that I've worked in, the minister can own a fishing company and set the quota and not get fired. You know, so understanding these complex dynamics and how decisions are made at the political level is so critical to understanding, you know, what the likelihood of success of interventions are. And I often think it's neglected. It's all very well to claim that your work has policy implications. That's not good enough, in my view. It's got to cascade right down to enforcement and regulation and consequence. Otherwise, it's theoretical. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Neville. No, I think those are very valid points. And I think that's why I try to make the point that this isn't just an interdisciplinary space, it's a deeply transdisciplinary space where there is this role for us to be embedded in those kinds of processes and also shaping sort of equitable and participatory processes in terms of some of those regulations and the accountability of those. But I'm not sure that science by itself can necessarily address some of the accountability and corruption challenges that you're mentioning as well. But yeah, I think very valid points and definitely an area of useful exploration.
Thanks.
Can I quickly just ask another question?
Sorry, there was just a question in the chat that went quite a way back. I'm just trying to find it. I think it was, sorry.
It's Nabonke.
Nabonke. Would you like to ask your question?
Should I read the question? Or would it be good to have Nabonke explain it, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it needs to be.
There we go.
Reset.
Hi, thank you. I'm talking from a mental health perspective and also the human capacity to deal with all these matters. And I was just wondering whether your work actually entails a whole different perspective on how we look at the human being, what is actually needed from us that had not been available up until now in the kind of theoretical and practical work that has been done with people in health generally. And I have a particular, it's just because I'm exploring these things from a psychological perspective as well as artistic. Where does the body actually come into this? It's a bit off the mark from what you're practicing, Belinda, but I was just wondering whether your thoughts had gone into that territory at all.
To be honest, not in any rigorous ways that I could talk about in a sort of public way like this. I mean, I think those are really interesting ideas. I do think there is a lot of work on the sort of psychology and resilience areas that I'm familiar with. And then, you know, obviously there is some interesting work on ecology, culture, spirituality, and even cognitive function that might be relevant to what you're referring to. But in terms of, you know, the whole human body, that isn't an area that I have much to say about at this stage. But I could certainly see if there's some resources or perhaps point you in some directions to people who might be working. I know there are a lot of philosophers who work on complexity as a philosophy. And there are some psychologists who work on, you know, complexity as part of their work too. So I'm assuming there'd be something, but I wouldn't be able to point you to it immediately.
Thank you.
The whole sort of, that whole angle is often also taken up in transdisciplinary research. You know, even thinking about interactions and relations within the team, the research team itself, but also their relations with the people that they're working with. There was a PhD thesis done at Rhodes University. I'll try, I can try and get the details for you. And she was a dancer, and she looked at the embodiment of dancing as a way for communication in doing transdisciplinary research. So there is some stuff out there. And I guess the transdisciplinary research that we've always worked in is really looking at, you know, sustainability and sustainable development goals and socio-ecological systems. So I'll see if I can get the details, and maybe you could have a look at that thesis, because apparently it was a phenomenal thesis.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Claire.
Thanks.
Cool. Any other questions? Just unmute yourself and ask ahead.
I think Mark had one.
Mark, do you want to go?
Yeah, it's good. I'll try. Sort of following on from Neville a little bit, but I'm just wondering if some of this transdisciplinary engagement is actually happening in the wrong places. So particularly with sort of formal governance structures or government structures, and whether sort of the science should be engaging in the activist space far more, in sort of social movements and that kind of thing, because we've sort of formal government has generally failed to deliver on sort of science policy linkages. And so, yeah, I don't know if you've thought about that at all, Belinda, but should we be rethinking how, I guess as engaged scientists, where we should be prioritizing our engagement?
Yeah, no, I think that is a very important question. I think that, I mean, there certainly is a lot of transdisciplinarity that happens with civil society and with the NGO sector. So, I mean, I don't think it stops with the government and the public sector. You know, I mentioned mostly intergovernmental and government processes here, but actually the work we did on resilience and development was much more in the CBO, NGO engagement space, and also engaging with local groups through those processes, and with there's work that's gone on with Indigenous and local peoples as well in the biodiversity space. So I'm not sure, that doesn't necessarily tick the activist box, although I think several of those groups would label themselves as activists. But I'm still thinking quite hard about the boundary between science and activism, and if there is a boundary, and whether people cross it, or whether knowledge crosses it, or whether values cross it. It's still something I think, you know, there's some people writing about it in the transdisciplinary space. But I think if we like to think that we're objective scientists that aren't involved in societal problem spaces, then we're probably deluding ourselves a little bit if we think we're not engaged. But being more thoughtful about that engagement is probably something we all need to challenge ourselves with. I'm pretty sure a lot of the early career people on this call are already much more deeply in that space than some of us, Mark. Does that answer a bit your question, or is it more?
I think it's a very sort of interesting thing of how you straddle I guess the issue of, I mean, the traditional view of science as being objective, and not, you know, so I mean, in the IPCC, we went to what's policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. But even within the IPCC author group, I mean, there's a huge pushback saying it's too late to be policy relevant. We need to be actually, you know, much more aggressive in what you're trying to say. And so I guess it is that, but then, as you say, that fuzzy boundary, and when do you sort of lose, I don't know what the word is, but lose potential influencing power because you're seen as an activist rather than as somebody who's, in theory, a bit more objective.
Yeah, well, I think that's also, I mean, so one of the bits of work that I'm doing at the moment is to work with the social justice and environmental justice communities to sort of bring those two communities together. And in that role, I don't see myself as an activist. I see myself as, you know, someone who can facilitate a conversation about the linkages between environmental and social justice, which I think are a very hot topic at the moment now. And sort of thinking about how much better it would be if we were addressing both at the same time and seeing the interconnections. So I can imagine that as a role where I'm not pretending to be objective, but I'm contributing insights and knowledge and ways of thinking to perhaps connect those two largely activist groups. But yes, it's certainly, I mean, I do think we need to challenge a lot of the ways we think about science as we move into these next couple of decades.